Welcome to this tutorial. In this tutorial, I'll be showing you how I mix Midi drum. Now, the Midi drum sounds like this without all the effect on. So with the effect, it sounds this way. So now let me not play it with the whole song. This is it without the effect on. Now with the effect on for the whole songs, the drum sounds like this now. Without wasting much time, let me jump into it. So I'm going to switch off my master effects, then I'm going to walk you through each instrument. Now, starting with the kick without effect sounds like this. With the effect on, the kick sounds like this. So let me walk you through how I process this particular kick. So for the kick processing, the first thing I had was a Pro Q3 from Far Filter. You could use any EQ to achieve this, but I just decided to use Pro Q3. Now, on the Pro Q3, what I did was that I had a low cut to about 20 hertz here. Then at about 32 hertz, I boosted that frequency. So let me solo it out. So I boosted that frequency there because that was where the more of the fundamental frequency of the kick was, and that was where the low energy was. At 141 hertz, I did a slight cut there. So if I'm to solo it alone, it sounds like this. I didn't like that because it was sounding a bit boxy for me. Then I did it, so I did cut that out. Here also at 338 hertz, I did a slight cut there, about minus 2 dB. You can see I'm just doing slight deep cuts. The first one was minus 1.67 dB. This one minus 2 dB. So if I'm to solo that, it sounds like this. So that was not necessary in the kick, so I just did cut that out. Also at 1061.4 hertz, I did a slight cut there. So I cut out that frequency by minus 2.1 dB. So at 2034 hertz, I did a slight boost about 2.18 dB just to give that kick the bitter sound. So I did a low pass filter just to cut the high a little bit at about 18732 hertz just to cut that out. So because I didn't want the kick to sound too bright. So without the EQ, it sounds like this. With the EQ, it sounds this way. Now, mind you, you won't want to process every kick this same way. I'm only showing you an approach how I did this kick for this MIDI drum. And this drum was from Addictive Drums. So the next thing I added here after the EQ was this compressor. With the compressor on, it sounds like this. Without the compressor, it sounds this way. So this compressor was from Presonus compressor, default compressor. So I was not really doing much. I just wanted the kick to sound round a bit. So I increased the ratio to about 3:1 and I reduced the ratio to about 15.36 dB. So I was looking for about minus 3 dB gain reduction while I also pay attention to what I can hear. So you could see about minus 2.13 dB. So for the attack, I kept the attack to about 5.14 milliseconds because I wanted the kick to punch well, you understand, to have that attack. And I dropped the release to about 2.7 9. So this setting was basically done with my ear. So what I do basically is I boost them so much, then I listen to them to where I feel is okay. You have to be careful with your attack and release because they can actually mess up the sound and they also determine the amount of reduction that happens. So you want to be careful with it. So that's what I did for this particular kick. So lastly, I added this saturation plugin, and this was for FabFilter Saturn 2. So without the plugin, it sounds like this. With the plugin, it sounds like this. So yeah, I used this gentle saturation, because I didn't want the saturation to be too heavy. So, and I adjusted this band drive to about 16.61% to what I felt it was okay for me. So I left it like that. So that was what I did for the kick basically. Then I changed this kick to the bass. So let me just quickly touch that basically, even though this is not supposed to cover other instruments. So for the sidechain, I came to my bass basically, then I loaded a compressor. Now, this compressor here, you could use any type of compressor, but what you want to do is to clearly look for where it can sidechain. So I click sidechain, then I sidechained it to the kick. Note that I've kept the compressor on the kick initially, but this compressor was to make the bass and the kick sing so that they give themselves space in the mix. So if I'm to solo the bass and the kick together without the sidechain, it will sound like this. So if I'm to horn the sidechain, it sounds this way. So you could hear the difference in that. So the next thing I have here is the snare. So for the snare, without the effect, it sounds like this. With the effect, it sounds this way. So let me just walk you through what I did. So for the snare, I only had an EQ and a gate. Now for the snare, I did a cut to about 80 hertz, basically. I did a slight boost about 182 hertz, about 2 dB, just to boost that frequency and give the snare width. Then here also at about 570 hertz, I did this slight cut about minus 1 dB. Let me just exaggerate that frequency so you hear it. So I just did cut that rubbish out. Then about 1.09k hertz, that's 1009 hertz. I did a slight cut about minus 2 dB. So let me exaggerate that. So I just cut out that nonsense away. And lastly, about 2.65 kilohertz, I did a slight cut about minus 2 dB. Let me exaggerate that frequency. So you could hear that whistle sound. I did cut that out. Lastly, I did a slight cut, a shelf cut at about 13.97 kilohertz, just to reduce the brightness of the snare a bit, because for me, I didn't really like it. So it was just a slight shelf cut. So without the EQ, it sounds like this. With the EQ, it sounds this way. So the last thing I added was a gate. So with the gate, it sounds like this. Without the gate, it sounds this way. Basically, this gate was just to cut out the tail of the snare and to make it sound full and uniform. So it sounds, so basically I adjusted the reduction rate to about minus 72 dB and the threshold to minus 26.8 dB. So this was just basically experimental till I found what I wanted. So lastly, the attack was 5 milliseconds and the old 50 milliseconds 80. I didn't really mess with the settings for the envelope, but my major concern was the threshold and the reduction range. So the kick and the snare together sounds like this. So the next one was the hi-hat. So the hi-hat without effect sounds like this. With effect, it sounds this way. So for the hi-hat, I did a cut to about 500 hertz because I was just needing maybe from the high mid range upward. So I just did a cut there, just set it here, and I didn't do anything to the hi-hat. So I made sure I chose a good hi-hat in my preset already, so I don't have to start EQing what I'm not supposed to EQ. So lastly, I noticed some slight peaks in the hi-hat and some fluctuation. So I added a compressor. So the hi-hat sounds like this without compressor. With the compressor on, it sounds like this. So the compressor wasn't doing too much. It was just to clamp down on those peaks and makes it look more uniform. So I didn't really mess with the attack and the release here. So I kept the ratio to about 3:1 and the threshold to about 25.6 dB. You don't want to cram all these threshold because basically your sound or your sample might be different. But basically the approach, you might just understand the approach and apply the same thing to your drums. So the next thing was the toms. So for the toms, what I did was I used a feature on Studio One called Strip Silence to just trim out the unnecessary part for the toms, the tail. Please, you have to be careful with this because sometimes these things actually cut out some important part or transient in an instrument. But for these toms, I actually did it because I knew that when the whole instrument come together, you won't actually feel the impact of that strip silence. So without the effect, the tom sounds like this. So with the effect, it sounds this way. For the EQ, at about 97.6 hertz, I boosted about 3 dB just to give the toms body. And I did a cut about minus 2 dB at 246 hertz. So if I'm to exaggerate that, it sounds like this. So I did cut that out a bit. Also at 847 hertz, I did a slight cut about minus 2 dB. So lastly, at 3.27 kilowatt, I did a slight cut about minus 2 dB. So let me exaggerate that. So I just cut that out. So lastly, I did a slight high cut at about 20 hertz. So the next thing and important thing I added was these gates here. Now the gate was just to kill the extra tail of the toms and allow the important part just come through the mix. So without the gate, it sounds like this. With the gate on, it sounds this way. So that was what I did. So for the envelope, I didn't mess around with it. So for the next tom, without effect, it sounds like this. With effect, it sounds this way. The first thing I did for this tom was to add EQ. I did a low cut about 45.0 hertz just to remove those rumbles. Also at 46.8 hertz, I boosted about 3 dB just to give that second toms that low energy. So at 170 hertz, I did a slight cut about minus 2 dB. So if I'm to exaggerate that, it sounds like this. So I just took that out. Also at 565 hertz, I did a wide cut about minus 2 dB. So let me exaggerate that. So I just cut out that nonsense out of that terms. Then lastly at 4.59 kilohertz, I did a slight cut about minus 2 dB. So let me exaggerate it. So I just cut that out. So that was all I did for the EQ. So without it, it sounds like this. With it, it sounds this way. So the next thing I added was a gate. This gate was just to kill the tails of the toms, after you hit the toms. So just to make it sound tight and full. So this threshold will be dependent on the type of toms you use and what you want to achieve. But basically, my reduction was basically minus 72 dB. Then I adjusted the threshold to about minus 30 dB. So I just played around with this till I got what I wanted to hear. So moving to the toms 3, the tom sounds like this without effect. With effect, it sounds this way. So what I did was to add an EQ. So on the EQ, I did a boost about 58.6 hertz. Now, if you notice something about the toms, I'm not boosting them at the same point. So I'm looking for where this tom has more of the fundamental frequency than I boost it. So I boosted this about 3 dB just to give it the weight on the low end. Then I did a cut about 40 hertz because it's toms and it contains some low information. That's why you see on the toms, basically, I'm not doing much low cut there. At about 198 hertz, I did a slight cut about minus 2 dB. This to cut out this frequency a bit. Also at about 524 hertz, if I to boost it, I cut out this frequency about -2 dB. Then I just did cut that. Also at 1.27 kilohertz, I did a slight cut about -2 dB. Let me exaggerate that. Again. Lastly, I did a high cut about 12.60 kilohertz. Yeah. This was just to roll off some of the high ends this time because basically I didn't actually want it. So lastly, I added a gate there, and this gate was just to kill the extra transient from the toms. So you have to be careful with this, and when you don't want your toms to just cut sharply, without all the whole fundamental transient going through it. So you have to be careful with this and listen carefully. So moving on to the side drum, what I did for the side drum was I added a EQ. Funny enough, I didn't add a gate on this side drum basically. So for this side drum, I did a much more smaller low cut, about 30.9 hertz, because it's a side drum and it contains a lot of low frequencies. On the side drum, I didn't actually boost anything. So I did this cut at about 2 hertz, about -2 dB. So let me exaggerate that. So I just cut that out a bit. Then for the other things, I didn't actually mess with it for this side drum basically. I just left it like that. So moving to the crash sounds like this without effect. So with effect, it sounds this way. So mind you, just like normal drum, there'll be bleeds in this crash. So for the crash, the first thing I added was an EQ. And, like I do say, you have to choose a good crash so that you don't have to start mixing and mixing. So you can see I only did a low cut about 277 hertz, and I left it like that. I didn't actually add anything. So the last thing I added was a compressor because I noticed some points in the crash, there was these peaks, you understand, that were peaking too much. So I added a compressor there just to tame it down a little bit. This compressor wasn't even really doing anything. So I just left it like that there. So you could see it wasn't doing anything, but you will notice this slight difference in heat. For the second crash, it sounds like this without effect. So with effect, it sounds this way. So for this second crash, I didn't do much. I did was to do a low cut to about 260 hertz. Then I cut everything below because I didn't actually do anything or mix around it. So the drum now sounds like this with effect. Without effect. With effect. So this particular drum, there was no room mic in it, but if peradventure there was a room mic, what I would have just done basically for the room mic was to cut it to about 200 or 300, just to give it body, then I'll adjust the volume. So this volume balancing is based on preference. So if you're having issues, you could use a good mix as a reference to balance this. So I basically balance this kick and everything in reference to the entire song. So let me just play the entire song so you hear how it sounds in the whole song. So the another thing I want to cover here before I round up this was the panning. So the kick was at the center, the snare was at the center. For the hi-hat was panned 20 to the right. Then for the tom 1, 20 to the right, tom 2, 15 to the right, and tom 3, 30 to the left. Then the side drum was about 60 to the left. Now, there are two ways to pan your drum. If you want to pan your drum as if you're the one playing it or from the audience perspective. So this particular drum was panned from the audience perspective. So the last thing here was this drum bus. I always use drum bus because most times I put my reverb as one. And if I need to put a collective effect, I just put them as one. I don't like sending my snare to a separate reverb, this to a separate reverb. I just send them to a group reverb once. So now I'll be switching off the effects and the master, then so that you could hear the difference on how the drum sounds. So let's go. So basically, that's how I mix my MIDI drums to sound well to me.